The mad, brilliant, and world-changing race for the Transcontinental Telegraph. How a line of wire conquered the American wilderness and united a nation. A true historical narrative. Prologue. It is 1860. Forget the gold rush, the clatter of trains, or the roar of industrial mills for a moment. Imagine a continent, vast and wild, where the fastest message travels on horseback, subject to blizzards, hostile raids, and the sheer cruelty of distance. Imagine a country divided by a vast, silent gulf of 2,000 miles, where news from the East Coast takes weeks, sometimes months, to reach the booming, untamed territories of the West. Picture a young nation, the United States, teetering on the precipice of civil war, a conflict that will tear it apart with astonishing speed. Information in this volatile landscape is not just power, it is the very fabric of unity and command. But while New York City could talk instantly to Boston, and Washington, D.C. could relay orders to Charleston, the sprawling, mineral-rich, and strategically vital land of California, which held the key to the nation's future, was a ghost limb, utterly disconnected from the heart of government. Then a whisper began to travel on the dusty winds of the prairies, a rumor of a copper thread, a single, fragile strand of wire strung across mountains and deserts, meant to conquer the impossible. It was a race against time, a scramble for political, military, and financial dominance that would pit visionaries against skeptics, engineers against nature, and determination against the brutal reality of the American frontier. The men who undertook this task were not typical heroes. They were ambitious, often ruthless, and possessed an almost maniacal belief in the future. Their venture was fraught with peril, from savage storms that snapped poles like twigs to the terrifying logistics of transporting tons of wire, glass insulators, and lumber deep into territories inhabited by indigenous tribes who viewed the line as an invasive, dangerous trespass. The prize? Instantaneous communication across a continent. The means? A feat of engineering madness. The consequence? Nothing less than the permanent and irreversible connection of the American West to the Union, changing the course of the Civil War, creating instant millionaires, and laying the very groundwork for the digital age we live in today. This is the true story of the Transcontinental Telegraph, the greatest and most desperate technological gamble of the 19th century. Its completion was an astonishing moment in history, a feat of human will that for a few electrifying hours made the entire world stand still. Chapter 1. The Tyranny of Distance. The week-long wait for tragedy. San Francisco, 1858. The air was thick with the scent of salt water, newly cut lumber, and the raw, intoxicating stench of a city built on sudden wealth and relentless ambition. Gold rush fortunes had fueled an explosive, haphazard growth that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. California was a land of staggering contrasts, immense wealth and grinding poverty, lawless frontiersmen and sophisticated urbanites, boundless optimism and deep, gnawing insecurity. This insecurity was rooted in one simple, agonizing truth: isolation. Imagine a critical dispatch arriving in Washington, D.C., a declaration of war, a major financial collapse, or, as would soon become devastatingly relevant, the election of a new, controversial president. That news, vital to the fortunes and stability of California, would first have to be entrusted to a system known as the Butterfield Overland Mail, or the Oxbow route. This was not an elegant system of swift riders. It was a grueling 2,800-mile, 25-day endurance test. Starting in St. Louis, Missouri, the massive, cumbersome stagecoaches, often pulled by 6 mule teams, traversed treacherous terrain down through Texas and New Mexico before turning west toward the Pacific. The route was chosen not for efficiency, but for political maneuvering, designed to avoid the harsh winters of the central route, but adding hundreds of miles of brutal desert and hostile territory. For a businessman in San Francisco trying to speculate on the New York stock market, a decision made in Wall Street in the morning was literally a month away from being actionable in California. Financial panic in the East could ruin a Californian merchant before he even learned it had occurred. For the U.S. Army, coordinating strategy against indigenous tribes or controlling the gold-rich territories was a bureaucratic nightmare. Orders were obsolete before they arrived.
But it was a disaster in the summer of 1858 that hammered home the tyranny of this distance with terrible clarity, pushing the need for instantaneous communication from an economic luxury to a national imperative. On September 11, 1858, the luxury steamship SS Central America, loaded with an estimated 30,000 pounds of California gold, fresh from the mines, was caught in a catastrophic hurricane off the coast of the Carolinas. She sank, taking with her over 425 souls and a vast fortune in gold that represented a significant percentage of the nation's gold supply. The tragedy was immediate and total for those aboard. For the East Coast, the news arrived relatively quickly via coastal telegraph lines. But out in California, the source of that lost wealth, a dreadful silence reigned. Families, investors, and the entire financial sector waited, day after agonizing day, for the arrival of the regular steamer from Panama that would bring the Eastern newspapers. The steamer was late, then overdue, then whispers began. For 13 days, the San Francisco Exchange was paralyzed by rumor, fear, and a chilling uncertainty about the fate of the Central America and its critical cargo. When the full, awful truth finally staggered into the harbor, the complete loss of the ship, the death toll, and the financial shockwave, the realization of their isolation was profound. The nation was connected, but the nation was not. California was an island of continental size, perpetually behind the curve of its own history. The need for a faster message system had reached a fever pitch. The Pony Express, a daring but ultimately fleeting solution, would be launched in 1860, but even its blinding speed, 10 days for the journey, was a temporary bandage on a deep, festering wound. What the country needed was not a faster horse. It needed lightning. The man with the map and the monomania. The man who would finally, relentlessly drive this vision into reality was a pragmatic, often overlooked figure, Theodore Judah. Known in later railroad history as the Crazy Judah, he was, in 1860, a brilliant, obsessive, and utterly monomaniacal civil engineer from New York. Judah's first love was the Transcontinental Railroad, a project he championed with messianic zeal. But Judah, a man who saw the nation not as it was, but as it would be, understood an immediate truth. The railroad would take years, even decades, to build. The telegraph, however, could be completed in months. He was in Washington, D.C. constantly, lobbying for the railroad, but he was also acutely aware of the political machinations surrounding the telegraph. For years, inventors like Samuel Morse and Alfred Vail had proven the technology worked. Telegraph wires crisscrossed the eastern states, but attempts to bridge the vast gap to the Pacific had been thwarted by the same factors that afflicted the mail route: logistics, cost, and the sheer scale of the wilderness. In the late 1850s, the political battle for the Transcontinental Telegraph centered on the Pacific Telegraph Bill. Congress, perpetually gridlocked by sectional disputes over slavery and the route the line should take, Northern versus Southern, repeatedly failed to pass a definitive funding bill. Enter Hiram Sibley, the formidable head of the newly formed Western Union Telegraph Company. Sibley was a financial and corporate titan, a man who consolidated numerous small, competing telegraph firms into a powerful, almost monopolistic entity. He was ruthless, politically connected, and absolutely convinced that the Transcontinental Telegraph was the future of American commerce and a colossal fortune waiting to be made. He didn't just want to build the line, he wanted to control it. He needed a partner, a government commitment, and a brilliant, boots-on-the-ground engineer who knew the West. The political breakthrough finally came with the escalating threat of civil war. As Southern states threatened secession, the need to secure and solidify ties with California, rich in gold and strategic ports, became a matter of national survival. In 1860, Congress finally passed an act, heavily influenced by Sibley's lobbying power, offering a substantial subsidy, $40,000 a year for 10 years, to the company that could string a line from the existing Western Union network in the East to the existing lines in California. It was an unprecedented sum, a massive government commitment to a private venture. The race was now official. 2 fronts, 1 deadline. The task was split into 2 formidable segments, creating a frantic, unprecedented race. The West Coast connection, California to Salt Lake City. This section, which needed to cover roughly 900 miles across the Sierra Nevada and the vast arid deserts of Nevada, was awarded to the California State Telegraph Company. Their chief engineer was James Gamble, a capable man, but one operating in a territory of immense topographical and logistical challenge. The East Coast connection, Omaha, Nebraska to Salt Lake City, this 1,100-mile stretch across the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains, was the most daunting, fraught with the danger of vast, unpopulated areas, hostile weather, and severe encounters with Plains Indian tribes. This contract was effectively controlled by Hiram Sibley's Western Union, who entrusted the actual construction to his partner, Edward Creighton. Creighton was Sibley's perfect counterpoint, a practical, powerful man of the frontier who had made his name driving cattle and building short-haul telegraph lines across the Midwest. He was a man of action, not theory, with a legendary ability to inspire or browbeat thousands of workers into completing impossible tasks. He approached the job with a brutal simplicity. It was a matter of sheer manpower, speed, and endurance. The deadline was impossibly tight, October 1861. Less than 16 months to survey, finance, supply, and build 2,000 miles of telegraph line across some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, all while the country was dissolving into civil war. The mad logistics of the line. The first immediate problem was material. A single mile of telegraph line required poles, approximately 30 to 35 cedar or pine poles, each 25 to 30 feet long. Over 2,000 miles, this meant over 60,000 poles had to be sourced, felled, hauled, and planted, often in territories utterly devoid of suitable timber. Wire. 2,000 miles of number 9 iron wire. This was not lightweight copper. It was heavy, durable iron, weighing an incredible 250 pounds per mile. The total weight of the wire alone was over 500,000 pounds, or 250 tons, which had to be shipped from New York, brought up river by boat, and then dragged across the plains by wagons. Insulators, the vital glass or ceramic doorknobs that prevented the signal from bleeding into the poles. Each pole needed one, meaning another 60,000 delicate objects had to survive a 1,000-mile journey over bone-jarring terrain.
Chapter 2. The Two Armies of the Wire. The Eastern Blitz. Creighton's ruthless pace. Edward Creighton, the Eastern Superintendent, was not a man of patience. His mantra was speed, and his method was relentless organization. By the spring of 1861, as the United States began tearing itself apart with the thunder of war, Creighton had already pushed his logistical masterpiece into motion from Omaha, Nebraska. Omaha was the railhead, the last bastion of civilization before the vast, unforgiving Great Plains. Every single spool of iron wire, every barrel of tar, and every glass insulator had to be hauled from the east, loaded onto heavy wagons, and moved west. Creighton didn't rely on the slow, expensive stage lines. Instead, he employed a colossal freight operation of his own, utilizing hundreds of prairie schooner wagons and thousands of oxen and mules, moving in convoys that stretched for miles across the plains. His construction crews, a ragtag army of former soldiers, immigrants, and hardened frontier laborers, were divided into specialized gangs. The Pole Gang. First, they had to solve the timber crisis. The plains were practically treeless. Creighton ordered his men to scour the river bottoms of the Platte, Missouri, and Elkhorn rivers, felling every available cottonwood tree. These were soft, perishable, and inferior, but they were local. Where no trees could be found, his crews hauled massive amounts of split cedar from the distant forests of Minnesota, moving them across hundreds of miles of open land. This gang averaged 1 mile of pole setting per day. The Digging Gang. Armed with specialized augers and shovels, they attacked the hard prairie sod. The holes had to be 3 to 5 feet deep to keep the heavy poles upright in the face of the brutal plains wind. They cursed the sun-baked earth and the occasional flash floods that turned their carefully dug holes into mud pits. The Wiring Gang. These were the elite. They followed the poles, unreeling the heavy spools of wire from the backs of wagons. Linemen, often young and agile, climbed the poles with climbing spurs and strapped on the glass insulators, securing the wire with practiced precision. This process, known as stringing, was the true measure of their progress. Creighton maintained a military discipline. Crews that fell behind were quickly disbanded. The pressure was immense, but the wages were high, often $50 a month, a good sum for a laborer. And the sense of purpose, of linking the nation at its most desperate hour, was intoxicating. By July of 1861, the Eastern Division was a well-oiled machine, laying over 100 miles of line per week as they crossed the sandy riverbeds and rolling hills towards Fort Laramie. The Western Struggle, Gamble's Mountain Nightmare. Meanwhile, over 1,000 miles to the west, James Gamble faced a completely different and arguably more difficult set of challenges. His task was to build east from Carson City, Nevada, toward Salt Lake City, across the treacherous Sierra Nevada and the vast, bone-dry expanse of the Great Basin. The problems were inverted. Timber. The Sierras had plenty of timber, but it was enormous, dense pine and redwood, making it incredibly difficult to fell and haul. The logging operations had to be carved out of steep, snow-fed mountainsides. Dynamite had to be used to blast paths for the wagons and holes for the poles through solid granite. Desert. Once through the mountains, the crews hit the desert, the searing, waterless basins of Nevada and Utah. Here, the poles and water had to be hauled for hundreds of miles. Gamble's men often found themselves relying on a daily ration of water brought by dedicated water wagons, a system prone to failure and theft. Gamble's operation was hampered by the same chaotic labor market that fueled the gold rush. Men were constantly quitting to chase the latest mineral strike, leading to high turnover and poor morale. His crews, unlike Creighton's relatively centralized force, were spread thin, trying to manage logistics from isolated, rudimentary camps. Despite the difficulties, the Western teams performed their own technological feats. The Dunner Pass, infamous for the tragic Dunner Party, had to be conquered. The poles here were massive, set deep to withstand colossal snow loads, and the line had to be protected from rock slides and winter ice. The two armies of the wire, separated by a seemingly endless stretch of hostile land, were now racing towards a single point on the map: Salt Lake City, Utah Territory.
Chapter 3. The Threat from Within and Without. The Confederacy's Sabotage. The Civil War had begun in earnest, and the significance of the Transcontinental Telegraph was immediately recognized by both sides. For President Abraham Lincoln and the Union, the line was crucial. It secured California's gold, the lifeblood of the Union war effort, and its ports, essential for global trade. It was a literal thread of Union steel across the country. The Confederacy, therefore, saw it as a prime target. As the Eastern Line pushed through Nebraska, it was well north of the primary battle lines, but the threat of Confederate sympathizers and guerrilla fighters on the western border was very real. They understood that crippling the line would paralyze the Union's financial nerve center. Sabotage began to occur on the existing less protected lines further east. Southern-aligned groups would cut the wires, chop down poles, or, more insidiously, tap the lines to intercept. Western Union immediately hired security details, often Pinkerton agents or armed guards, to patrol the vital link, marking the beginning of the use of technological infrastructure as a tool and target of modern warfare. The resistance of the Plains tribes. More formidable and consistent than Confederate sabotage was the resistance from the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho. The telegraph line was a clear sign of the permanent, catastrophic invasion of their hunting grounds. The line followed the primary emigrant trails, which had already decimated the buffalo herds, the very foundation of their culture and survival. The talking sticks were perceived as an instrument of magic or a blasphemous sign of the white man's power over the land. Initial interactions were marked with curiosity. Tribesmen would gather around the poles, listening to the humming sound of the wire, caused by the wind and the electrical current. They would press their ears to the poles, convinced they were hearing the spirits or the voices of the invaders. But curiosity quickly turned to hostility. The telegraph poles offered a convenient source of wood in the treeless plains. Tribesmen began cutting them down to use for lodge poles or for firewood. The destruction was often systematic. A gang would fell miles of poles at once, carrying off the wire to be melted down for ornaments or weapons. Edward Creighton, determined to maintain his speed, had to engage in a delicate, dangerous diplomacy. He often sent agents ahead of his construction crews, laden with gifts, blankets, tobacco, sugar, and flour, to negotiate safe passage. He had to convince local chiefs that the talking wire was harmless and that his men were merely passing through. These treaties were fragile and often broken by rogue bands or by the actions of aggressive settlers or soldiers. The constant need to repair cut lines and replace downed poles added an unbearable strain to the construction schedule. The job of a lineman became one of the most dangerous in the West. Often riding the line, often alone, exposed to the elements and the risk of ambush. Despite the immense political turmoil and the constant frontier danger, the two teams pushed relentlessly toward their shared center point. The eyes of Washington, D.C. and San Francisco were fixed on the map, waiting for the final impossible gap to close. The fate of the Union, they knew, might depend on the speed of a single copper thread. Chapter 4. The Final Gap. Meeting in Zion. The city of Salt Lake City, Utah Territory, was a geopolitical oddity. Settled by the Mormons under Brigham Young, it was isolated, self-governing, and deeply suspicious of the federal government that had sent troops to control them just a few years earlier. Yet Salt Lake City was the perfect midpoint, a supply depot, a center of population, and the agreed-upon location for the two lines to meet. In August and September of 1861, the tension was palpable. The eastern and western crews, now within a few hundred miles of each other, began an almost frantic acceleration. Creighton's men, having crossed the Continental Divide and passed Fort Bridger, were laying track across the arid scrubland of western Wyoming and eastern Utah. Gamble's men were fighting their way through the last of the desert, finally finding the relative civilization of the Great Salt Lake Valley. The news that the lines were nearing completion traveled ahead of the wire itself, sparking a wave of celebration and speculation. Brigham Young, the powerful leader of the Mormons, understood the profound importance of the line. It would end his territory's isolation and bring it into immediate contact with the world. He ensured that the Mormon population offered the crews assistance, lumber, and supplies, a critical final push. The final days were pure chaos. The crews, exhausted, sun-scorched, and battling early mountain snows, worked around the clock. The world hears a click. On October 24, 1861, the two lines met. The final pole was erected in Salt Lake City, and the ends of the wires were spliced together with a simple joint. The crowd that gathered was a unique mix of hardened linemen, Mormon settlers, government officials, and curious indigenous observers. The first message sent that morning was a technical query, followed by a rush of official communications. But the message that truly mattered, the one that announced the end of the tyranny of distance, was sent by Brigham Young himself to the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Utah has not seceded, but is firm for the Constitution and laws of our country, and will comfort and befriend all officers and soldiers who may be sent here. This was a declaration of loyalty at a moment when Lincoln desperately needed it. The instant response from the White House confirmed that the connection was complete. A few hours later, the official, historic message from the president of the Overland Telegraph Company, Hiram Sibley, was sent. To the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, the line is completed. This is the first message over the wire connecting the Pacific Coast with the seat of government. The response penned by Lincoln's assistant was succinct and powerful, acknowledging the moment of national union at a time of deep division. The message included a promise: the government would immediately use the line for all official communications. The end of the pony. The most immediate and poignant consequence of the telegraph's completion was the instantaneous collapse of its short-lived predecessor. The Pony Express, which had been hailed as the marvel of the age, a 10-day dash across the plains, had run its last dramatic race. The company that ran the Pony Express, the freight giant Russell, Majors, and Waddell, was the same company that held the mail contract that the telegraph had now rendered obsolete. Their riders who had faced death, disease, and weather to shave mere days off the mail route were suddenly irrelevant. The telegraph company actually utilized many of the former Pony Express stations as relay points for their operators. But the romantic, dangerous era of the mounted message was over. The final official message carried by the Pony Express was sent out west on October 24, 1861, just hours before the wires were joined. It was a melancholy dispatch announcing that, as of that day, the service was dissolved. The Transcontinental Telegraph had not only bridged the continent, it had violently and irrevocably accelerated the pace of life in America. The United States was, for the first time, truly united by a single, invisible thread of information. Chapter 6. The Boom of Information. The press was the first private entity to capitalize fully. Previously, newspapers on the West Coast had to wait a month for news from the East. Now they received it hours after it happened. The Associated Press, AP, which had formed years earlier to pool resources for expensive telegraph dispatches, saw its power skyrocket. A story that broke in London on Monday could appear in a San Francisco paper by Tuesday morning. This instantaneity fundamentally changed how Americans viewed their country and their world. They were no longer isolated communities, but part of a continuous, shared national conversation. Public opinion could now rapidly form on events, putting pressure on politicians in real time. The stock market was forever changed. The era of arbitrage, where a merchant in San Francisco could profit for weeks on insider knowledge that had yet to reach the rest of the continent, was over. Market prices for gold, silver, and commodities were instantly synchronized between New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. This forced a massive, sudden consolidation of financial power and ushered in the modern era of the national market. Chapter 6. The Iron Horse Follows the Wire. The Wire's Legacy, a Pathfinder. While the Transcontinental Telegraph was a technological marvel, its most profound and lasting legacy was its role as the pathfinder for the Transcontinental Railroad. Theodore Judah,
Chapter 7. The Deserts and the Prophets. The Hell of the Great Basin. While Edward Creighton's Eastern Division battled the vast, empty plains and powerful indigenous resistance, James Gamble's Western teams wrestled with the geological purgatory of the Great Basin. This region, stretching from the Sierra Nevada to the Wasatch Range, was a land of dry lakes, towering salt flats, and sudden isolated mountain ranges. The construction here was less about distance and more about sheer survival. Logistics of thirst. Water was the great enemy. Teams often had to haul water for themselves, their animals, and the pole treatment process for stretches of over 60 miles. The oppressive heat of the Nevada summer meant that wooden poles, even if treated with tar, dried out and cracked almost instantly. Crews survived on meager rations of brackier than usual water, often guarded jealously by armed escorts. The alkaline dust. The relentless wind whipped up clouds of alkaline dust from the dry lake beds, coating the workers, horses, and equipment. The dust caused severe lung irritation, eye infections, and often disabled the delicate electrical instruments. The glass insulators, crucial for preventing the current from leaking out, had to be constantly wiped clean to maintain conductivity. Finding the poles. The greatest logistical nightmare remained the procurement of wood. The short, gnarled scrub brush of the desert was useless. Gamble's men resorted to dragging timber from the distant eastern slopes of the Sierra Nevada, often requiring a 7-day haul just to deliver wood for a 50-mile stretch of the line. Where no wood was available at all, they used the only material the desert offered in abundance: rock. Massive stone cans, sometimes reaching 10 feet high, were erected with iron fixtures pounded into the top to hold the wire, creating eerie monuments to the crew's desperation. Brigham Young and the Copper Covenant. The single most critical factor in the success of the Western Line was the pragmatic cooperation of the Mormon community in Utah. The Mormons, led by their powerful prophet Brigham Young, were the only established, self-sufficient, non-hostile population center between Omaha and Sacramento. Young, despite his earlier conflicts with the U.S. government, was a visionary when it came to infrastructure. He saw the telegraph as essential for Mormon interests. It would instantly connect Salt Lake City to both coasts, providing faster communication for their global missionary efforts, and more importantly, providing advance warning of any federal troops marching into the territory. He essentially subcontracted the final, most complex section of the Western Line through Utah to Mormon work gangs. This was a masterstroke of efficiency. Labor. Mormon workers were highly disciplined, knew the terrain intimately, and were less prone to abandoning the work for a gold strike than the transient non-Mormon laborers. Resources. Young mobilized the community's resources, providing food, mules, and lumber from the mountain valleys, bypassing the complex and expensive process of hauling supplies across the Great Basin. The cooperation was mutually beneficial. It ensured the line's completion on time
and it gave Brigham Young an instant, powerful voice in national affairs. When he sent his famous message of loyalty to Lincoln, it solidified Utah's political position just as the war was escalating, demonstrating the immediate strategic value of his cooperation. Without the efficiency and organizational genius of the Mormon crews in that final stretch, the October 1861 deadline would likely have been missed.
Chapter 9. The Ghost in the Wire. The phenomenon of electrical fear. The Transcontinental Telegraph wasn't just a physical or logistical achievement, it was a psychological one. For the public, the idea of instantaneous communication across thousands of miles was baffling and, for many, terrifying. The ghost in the poles. For the uninitiated, the poles were the source of fear. On a dry, windy night, the iron wire, vibrating under tension, could produce a faint, audible hum. During a thunderstorm, the wire often collected static electricity, causing the insulators to sizzle or even arc with small blue sparks. Settlers and travelers along the route, unfamiliar with electricity, described the phenomena as the ghosts in the wire, or the talking spirits. For the indigenous tribes, the effect was even more profound. The poles were sometimes struck by lightning, shattering the wood or setting the tops on fire. This was proof, to many, that the talking sticks were possessed by powerful, angry spirits that the white men had unleashed upon the land. Their attempts to silence the wire by cutting the poles were often seen as ritualistic acts of self-defense against this terrifying invisible power. Creighton's ingenuity. Edward Creighton, ever the pragmatist, devised clever ways to deal with both the physical and psychological threats. When a crew reached the hostile area known for pole cutting, they began burying the wire underground in sections. This was far more labor-intensive and expensive, but it protected the line from casual vandalism. More ingeniously, he used the weather to his advantage. If a major storm was approaching that he knew would damage a section of the line, he would have an operator send a false message on that section, knowing the tribe would be listening. The message would warn of ghosts or curses being sent down the wire by the white man. While crude, this sometimes delayed or prevented attacks, as the tribes momentarily feared the invisible power coursing through the copper thread. The unstoppable repairman. The true testament to the system's success was not its construction, but its maintenance. The linemen became legendary figures of the American West, as rugged and iconic as the cowboys they shared the frontier with. Their job was simple: keep the line working no matter the obstacle. They carried minimal supplies: wire cutters, spare insulators, a coil of replacement wire, a rifle, and basic rations. Their patrol was often 100 miles of dangerous exposed territory. They had to be expert trackers, able to identify the signs of a fallen pole in a snowdrift, a cut wire hidden in the tall prairie grass, or the footprints of a raiding party. The daily risks were staggering: attacks by hostile groups, venomous snakes and insects, sudden storms that could drop the temperature 50 degrees in an hour, and the constant threat of starvation or exposure. Yet these men were driven by the knowledge that they held the literal communication lifeblood of the nation in their hands. A message from Lincoln to a Western military commander, a major bank transfer, or a desperate personal telegram depended entirely on their grit and skill. The continuous repair and protection of this single, exposed wire became the permanent, ongoing battle that defined the infrastructure of the American frontier for the next 2 decades. Chapter 10. The Monopoly and the Millionaires. Hiram Sibley's Empire. The successful completion of the Transcontinental Telegraph was the crowning achievement of Hiram Sibley, the visionary and ruthless head of Western Union. Sibley had secured the critical government subsidy, cornered the market on materials, and expertly managed the entire Eastern construction, cementing his company's position as the undisputed communications titan of the era. The moment the wire was connected, Western Union held a near absolute monopoly on transcontinental communication. They could, and did, charge exorbitant rates. The initial rate structure was designed to maximize profit, $7.40 for a 10-word message between New York and San Francisco. This was an astronomical sum, equivalent to several $100s today, which immediately restricted the line's use primarily to wealthy merchants, government officials, and the press. Sibley was not content with just the Transcontinental line. He systematically began buying up or undercutting every smaller regional telegraph company across the West. Within a few years, Western Union became the first great American industrial monopoly, controlling the flow of news, finance, and personal correspondence across a continent. This immense power allowed Sibley and his associates, like Ezra Carnell, who would later use his fortune to found Carnell University, to become instant millionaires, demonstrating that in the new American economy, infrastructure and information were as valuable as gold. The golden flood of finance. The most immediate and profound economic shift was the homogenization of the national stock market. Before the telegraph, the price of gold in San Francisco often lagged behind New York by weeks, allowing for telegraphic arbitrage, where savvy operators who could afford the wire could profit hugely by anticipating price shifts. With the wire fully functional, these price differences vanished almost overnight. The market for gold, commodities, and railroad bonds was instantly synchronized. This event was a critical step in transforming disparate regional markets into the single unified American economy of the late 19th century. The sheer volume of financial data, quotes, contracts, and transfer confirmations flooding the line made Western Union an indispensable, if despised, part of the American capitalist machinery.
Chapter 11. The Lineman's War and the Buffalo's Lament. The constant battle for the wire. The completion of the line in 1861 simply marked the transition from a construction war to a maintenance war. The single-strand iron wire remained heartbreakingly fragile against the forces of the American West. The greatest persistent threat was the blizzard. A single major winter storm in the Rocky Mountains or the Sierra Nevada could snap poles like toothpicks for miles, blanketing the fallen wire under feet of snow. Repairing such damage meant sending linemen out on snowshoes or sleighs, often risking their lives in whiteout conditions to splice the wire back together in sub-zero temperatures. The most dangerous, however, remained the indigenous resistance. The destruction of the telegraph poles and the wire became a calculated strategic act of war by the Lakota, Cheyenne, and other tribes. They realized that by cutting the wire, they could paralyze military response and stall the inexorable advance of settlers and soldiers. The pole-cutting raids. Raiding parties would ride in swiftly, cutting down dozens of poles and dragging away the wire. The poles were burned, and the wire was sometimes used or simply discarded to ensure the break was permanent. Decoys and ambush. Linemen sent to repair a break often found themselves riding into a decoy. A short cut in the line might be a deliberate lure to draw the lone repairman into an ambush, underscoring the lethal nature of the job. The U.S. Army became, by necessity, a protector of the wire. Military outposts along the line were tasked with patrolling their section, and companies of soldiers were often detailed solely to guarding the infrastructure. This ongoing conflict over the communication line was a fundamental part of the Indian Wars of the 1860s and 1870s, making the Transcontinental Telegraph a direct symbol and instrument of American expansion and conquest. The end of the buffalo. The telegraph also played a subtle but devastating role in the ultimate destruction of the plains ecosystem. Its connection to the railroad, which began construction soon after the line's completion, accelerated the hunting of the American bison. The wire, running parallel to the new rail lines, allowed hunters and commercial operators to coordinate their efforts instantly. Orders for buffalo hides or meat from eastern markets could be wired west, and hunters could be quickly dispatched to the nearest herd location, creating an industrial-scale slaughter. The disappearance of the buffalo, the spiritual and economic cornerstone of the Plains tribes, was both aided and chronicled by the very wire that spanned their diminishing land. Chapter 12. The Iron Horse Catches Up. From Wire to Rails. The eventual, inevitable rival to the Transcontinental Telegraph was the Transcontinental Railroad. Built over 6 grueling years, 1863 to 1869, the railroad followed the same general path pioneered by Creighton and Gamble. The telegraph, however, served the railroad throughout its construction. Coordination. The telegraph was used daily to coordinate supply trains, order materials, and direct the massive workforce, acting as the rail line's central nervous system long before the tracks were finished. The Golden Spike. When the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroads finally met at Promontory Summit, Utah, on May 10, 1869, the telegraph was central to the ceremony. As the final ceremonial golden spike was driven into the tie, an engineer connected the hammer to a telegraph wire. The final blows were instantly transmitted as electrical pulses to telegraph offices in New York, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C., announcing the union of the rails to the entire waiting continent with a synchronized click. The railroad instantly made the telegraph line safer and easier to maintain, as repairmen could now use trains to reach broken sections quickly, and the physical presence of the rails offered more protection from pole-cutting raids. The quiet obsolescence. The Transcontinental Telegraph remained in operation for decades, but its reign as the sole voice of the continent was brief. By the 1870s, new innovations began to chip away at its dominance. Multiple wires. Western Union, facing huge demand, began stringing a second, third, and fourth wire on the poles, drastically increasing capacity and reliability. Duplex and quadruplex. Brilliant inventors like Thomas Edison developed technologies like the duplex, sending 2 messages simultaneously, and the quadruplex, sending 4 messages simultaneously, multiplying the line's capacity by 4 without laying any new wire. The rise of the telephone. By the late 1870s, Alexander Graham Bell's invention of the telephone offered the possibility of voice transmission. While the telegraph remained the dominant force for commercial and press messages for decades, the slow rise of the telephone hinted at the ultimate eventual obsolescence of the click and dash system. The original Transcontinental Telegraph line, built with such ferocious speed and determination, was eventually replaced by more robust, multiple wire systems, often buried or utilizing better treated poles. The physical presence of the original copper thread eventually vanished, but its legacy was permanent. It had performed the single greatest task in its history. It held the Union together, financed the Civil War, erased the physical distance between the coasts, and laid the literal foundation, the poles, the route, and the vision for all modern American communications, making the country an integrated nation for the first time. The age of isolation ended not by the blast of a cannon or the arrival of a ship, but with the quiet, triumphant click of a single, fragile wire in the heart of the American West.